In the rolling hills of Colorado's Millbrook Valley, where the morning mist clung to pine-covered slopes and the sound of rushing water from Mill Creek provided a constant backdrop to daily life, there lived stories of love that challenged the very foundations of what a small frontier town believed about beauty, worth, and the courage to stand against cruelty. The year was 1885, and Millbrook Valley had grown from a rough mining camp into a proper settlement, complete with whitewashed church spires, neat picket fences, and the kind of social hierarchies that seemed to spring up wherever people gathered, in numbers large enough to form opinions about one another. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But perhaps no story would shake the foundations of this seemingly peaceful community quite like that of Sarah Mitchell, a young woman whose journey to find love would expose the darkness that lurked beneath polite society's carefully maintained facade. Sarah possessed the kind of gentle spirit that drew children to her like flowers to sunlight, a quick wit that could make even the sternest shopkeeper crack a smile, and hands that could coax life from the most stubborn garden soil. Yet in the eyes of Millbrook Valley's self-appointed guardians of propriety, she carried one unforgivable flaw that would make her the target of whispered conversations and pointed fingers. The tale begins with a wedding that never was, a public humiliation so complete that it would drive a kind soul from the only home she had ever known. It speaks of a gentle giant whose massive hands could shape iron with the delicacy of an artist, yet whose heart proved even more remarkable than his strength. Most importantly, it reveals how sometimes the most profound acts of heroism come not from drawing swords or firing guns, but from the simple courage to say you are enough when the entire world insists otherwise. Thomas Bennett stood 6 feet and 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world and arms that could bend horseshoes. With the same ease most men might snap a twig. His forge had become the beating heart of Millbrook Valley's working district, where the rhythm of his hammer against anvil provided a steady counterpoint to the bustle of daily commerce. Those who knew him spoke of his uncommon gentleness, how he could shoe the most skittish horse with barely a whisper, how children would gather around his workshop to watch him transform raw metal into works of practical art. Yet Thomas carried his own burden of loneliness, a man whose imposing presence had convinced many that someone of his size must surely be as rough and crude as the iron he worked. The truth was far different. He read poetry by candlelight, tended a garden behind his shop with the care of a devoted mother, and possessed an artist's eye for beauty that had nothing to do with what others deemed acceptable or proper. He was a man still waiting for someone to see past the surface, to understand that the largest hearts often came in the most intimidating packages. The story of how these two souls found each other begins on what should have been the happiest day of Sarah's life, but instead became a moment of such profound cruelty that it would ripple through the entire community. For in Millbrook Valley, as in so many places where small minds wielded outsized influence, the measure of a woman's worth had become twisted into something ugly and shallow, something that would soon meet its match in the form of a blacksmith who understood that true beauty had nothing to do with the judgments of small-minded people. The morning of June 15, 1885, dawned clear and bright over Millbrook Valley, with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made everything seem possible. Sarah Mitchell stood before the mirror in her small room above Henderson's general store, adjusting the delicate lace veil that had belonged to her grandmother. The wedding dress, sewn by her own careful hands over the course of 3 months, fit her curves with the precision of a loving embrace. She had chosen cream-colored silk, not the stark white that fashion dictated, because she understood that softer colors complemented her auburn hair and warm brown eyes. At 24, Sarah had already weathered more storms than most women. Her age. Her parents had died in an influenza outbreak when she was 17. leaving her to make her own way in a world that offered few opportunities for unmarried women. She had supported herself through needlework, taking in sewing and alterations for the ladies of Millbrook Valley. Her small room was filled with evidence of her skill, intricate embroidery samples, carefully mended garments, and the tools of her trade arranged with the precision of a craftsman. The arrangement with Henry Caldwell had seemed like a blessing when it was first proposed 6 months earlier. Henry owned the largest dry goods store in the valley, a position that granted him considerable influence in the community's social circles. He was considered quite a catch by the standards of frontier society, financially stable, reasonably handsome, and possessed of the kind of easy charm that made him popular at community gatherings. Their courtship had been proper and public, conducted under the watchful eyes of Millbrook Valley's social arbiters. Yet Sarah had noticed troubling signs in recent weeks. Henry's compliments had grown fewer and more strained. His touches, once gentle and reassuring, had become perfunctory, as if he were going through the motions of affection rather than feeling it. When she had mentioned her excitement about their future home, he had responded with distracted nods and comments about adjustments that would need to be made. She had attributed his behavior to pre-wedding nerves, the same anxiety that kept her awake at night, wondering if she truly knew the man she was about to marry. St. Mary's Church stood at the center of Millbrook Valley, its white spire rising above the surrounding buildings like a beacon of hope and faith. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews that had been polished to a warm gleam for the occasion. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she walked down the aisle, her hand resting on the arm of Dr. William Hayes, who had agreed to give her away in the absence of family. The doctor had been one of the few people in town who had shown her consistent kindness since her parents' death. His weathered face was kind, his gray eyes holding the wisdom of someone who had seen both the best and worst of human nature. As they approached the altar, he squeezed her hand gently and whispered, "You look radiant, my dear. Any man would be fortunate to call you his wife." Henry Caldwell stood at the altar in his finest suit, his blonde hair carefully pomaded and his mustache waxed to perfection. He cut a dashing figure, and Sarah felt a flutter of pride that this well-regarded man had chosen her. Reverend Marcus Webb, a thin man with sharp features and an unfortunate tendency toward moral superiority, waited with his prayer book open. The church was filled with the leading families of Millbrook Valley, women in their finest dresses and men in their Sunday suits, all gathered to witness what should have been a joyous celebration. But something was wrong. Sarah sensed it in the way conversation stopped too abruptly when she appeared, in the sideways glances and barely suppressed whispers that followed her progress down the aisle. Henry's expression, when she finally reached him, was not that of a man greeting his beloved bride. Instead, his face showed a mixture of embarrassment and something that looked disturbingly like disgust. The ceremony began with the traditional words, Reverend Webb's voice carrying across the silent church with practiced authority. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the joining of Henry Caldwell and Sarah Mitchell in holy matrimony." The familiar phrases should have brought comfort, but Sarah found herself growing increasingly uneasy as she noticed the way Henry avoided meeting her eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he took his place beside her. The first sign of real trouble came during the exchange of vows. When Reverend Webb asked if Henry took Sarah to be his lawfully wedded wife, there was a pause that stretched far too long. The silence in the church became oppressive, broken only by the sound of Sarah's increasingly rapid breathing and the distant call of a crow outside the stained glass windows. Henry began, then stopped, his face flushing red. He looked out at the congregation, then back at Sarah, his expression tormented. "I cannot do this." The words fell into the church like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and confusion that spread through the assembled crowd. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet, her world tilting on its axis as she struggled to understand what was happening. Henry? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She whispered, her voice barely audible above the sudden buzz of whispered conversations. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Henry said, his voice louder now, carrying to every corner of the church. "I thought I could go through with it, but I cannot marry someone who looks like you do." The words came out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back for so long that they erupted with violent force. "My business associates, my social standing. I cannot be tied to someone who is so obviously unsuitable." The cruelty of his words was matched only by their public nature. Sarah felt as if she had been physically struck, her breath catching in her throat as the full impact of his rejection hit her. Around them, the congregation erupted in gasps and whispers, some expressing shock at Henry's behavior, others nodding in apparent agreement with his assessment. Victoria Ashford, the wife of the Valley's most successful rancher and the unofficial leader of Millbrook Valley's social hierarchy, was among the first to speak. "Well," she said in a voice loud enough to carry throughout the church, "I suppose we should have seen this coming." Poor Henry, trapped by his own kindness into making an arrangement he clearly regrets. Her words opened the floodgates. Other voices joined in, each comment more cutting than the last. "Such a shame," murmured Eleanor Blackwood, the shopkeeper's wife. "That poor man, having to choose between his reputation and his misguided charity." Another woman, whose name Sarah couldn't quite place through the haze of her shock, added, "Perhaps this will teach her to be more realistic about her prospects." The most devastating blow came from Reverend Webb himself, who seemed to view the situation as an opportunity to deliver a moral lesson to his congregation. "Perhaps," he said in his measured, authoritative voice, "this unfortunate situation serves as a reminder that we must all be mindful of our proper place in society. The good Lord gives us each certain gifts and limitations, and wisdom lies in accepting both with grace." Dr. Hayes, standing beside Sarah, felt her sway as the full weight of public humiliation crashed down upon her. His arm went around her shoulders, offering what little protection he could against the verbal assault. "That's quite enough," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. "This young woman deserves better than this public cruelty." But the damage was done. Sarah's wedding dress, which had made her feel beautiful and hopeful just moments before, now felt like a costume in a cruel play. The flowers in her bouquet, carefully chosen and arranged that morning, seemed to mock her with their beauty. Most painfully, the ring Henry had given her during their engagement felt like a weight around her finger, a symbol of promises that had been broken in the most public and humiliating way possible. Through her tears, Sarah became aware of movement. At the back of the church, Thomas Bennett had been working at his forge when the sound of raised voices from the church had drawn his attention. He was not a regular churchgoer, feeling out of place among the finely dressed members of Millbrook Valley's social elite, but something about the commotion had compelled him to investigate. He stood in the doorway now, his massive frame filling the entrance, his leather apron still tied around his waist, and his hands still bearing the honest stains of his work. From his position, he could see Sarah's shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs, could hear the cruel whispers that continued to ripple through the congregation, like poison spreading through water. Thomas had noticed Sarah before, of course. In a town the size of Millbrook Valley, everyone knew everyone else, at least by sight. He had watched her walking to and from the general store, had seen her kindness to children and her gentle way with the elderly customers who sought out her needlework skills. He had always thought her beautiful, with her warm smile and the way sunlight caught the copper highlights in her hair. More than that, he had recognized in her the same kind of loneliness that he carried, the isolation that came from being different, in a place that valued conformity above all else. The cruel words being spoken about her now ignited something in Thomas's chest, a anger that burned hotter than his forge. He had experienced his own share of judgment and rejection, had been dismissed by potential suitors for their daughters, because his size and profession marked him as unsuitable for polite society. But he had never seen cruelty displayed so publicly, had never witnessed someone's dreams being destroyed with such calculated precision. As Sarah turned to flee the church, her wedding dress rustling around her like broken wings, Thomas made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing in the suddenly quiet church, and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of absolute conviction. "Miss Mitchell." His words stopped her flight, caused her to turn with tear-stained cheeks and eyes that held the pain of public rejection. "If you would permit me, I would be honored to escort you from this place." The offer was simple, but in the context of what had just occurred, it carried the weight of a declaration. Thomas was publicly aligning himself with someone who had just been rejected and humiliated, was offering protection to someone that others had deemed unworthy. His presence, so different from the finely dressed merchants and ranchers who filled the church pews, served as a stark reminder that there were other ways to measure a person's worth. Victoria Ashford was the first to recover from the surprise of seeing the town's blacksmith interrupt what she clearly viewed as a necessary social correction. "Mr. Bennett," she said in a voice dripping with condescension, "surely you understand that this is a private matter. There's no need for you to involve yourself in what is clearly a fortunate escape from an unsuitable arrangement." Thomas turned, his attention to her, his dark eyes steady and unflinching. "I see a woman who has been treated with cruelty and disrespect," he said quietly. "In my understanding, that makes it everyone's business to offer whatever kindness and protection they can." His words created a ripple of unease through the congregation. Thomas Bennett was not a man who could be easily dismissed or intimidated. His size alone commanded respect, but more than that, his reputation for honesty and fair dealing had earned him a place in the community that transcended social hierarchies. When he spoke, people listened, even when they disagreed with his words. Henry Caldwell, perhaps realizing that his public rejection had gone too far, attempted to salvage some dignity from the situation. "Thomas, I appreciate your concern, but this is a matter between Sarah and myself. A private decision that unfortunately had to be made public. Nothing private about humiliating someone in front of the entire town." Thomas replied, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge of steel. "Nothing private about allowing good people to speak cruelty about someone who has shown nothing but kindness to this community." He extended his arm to Sarah, who stood frozen between flight and the strange comfort of having someone, anyone, speak in her defense. "Miss Mitchell, would you allow me to walk you home? I believe you've heard quite enough for one day." Sarah looked up at him through her tears, seeing perhaps for the first time the man who had been quietly observing her life from the edges of the community. Thomas Bennett was indeed imposing, his size and strength impossible to ignore, but his eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his physical presence. More importantly, he was offering her something that no one else in that church had: simple human dignity in the face of public humiliation. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and placed her hand on his offered arm. The contrast was striking, her delicate fingers against his massive forearm, her pale wedding dress against his dark work clothes. But there was something right about it, something that spoke to a deeper truth about compatibility and worth than the superficial judgments that had just destroyed her wedding day. As they walked toward the church door, the congregation parted before them like a sea of silk and judgment. Thomas's presence seemed to create a protective barrier around Sarah, his quiet strength offering shelter from the continued whispers and stares. Dr. Hayes followed close behind, his medical bag in hand and his expression grim with the knowledge of what this day's events would mean for Sarah's future in Millbrook Valley. The walk from the church to Sarah's small room above Henderson's general store should have taken only 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Word of the wedding's dramatic collapse had already begun to spread through the town like wildfire. People emerged from shops and houses to stare at the unlikely trio, the jilted bride in her cream-colored silk, the gentle giant who had appointed himself her protector, and the elderly doctor who served as their witness. Some of the stares held sympathy, recognizing the cruelty of what had occurred and feeling genuine pity for Sarah's public humiliation. Others held curiosity, wondering what this new development might mean for the complex social dynamics of their small community. But too many held the kind of satisfied malice that comes from seeing someone who had dared to reach above their station receive what others viewed as their deserved comeuppance. Thomas felt Sarah's hand trembling on his arm and adjusted his pace to match her faltering steps. Her wedding dress, beautiful as it was, had not been designed for walking long distances, and the emotional shock of what had just occurred was clearly taking its toll. When she stumbled slightly on the wooden sidewalk, he steadied her with a gentleness that belied his size, his touch as careful as if she were made of the finest crystal. "Just a little further," he murmured, his voice meant for her ears alone. "You're stronger than they know, Miss Mitchell. Stronger than they'll ever be." His words, simple as they were, created the first crack in the wall of devastation that had surrounded Sarah since Henry's rejection. Here was someone who saw strength where others saw only failure, who offered protection where others had provided only cruelty. She looked up at him with eyes that were beginning to show something other than pain, a small spark of gratitude that would, in time, grow into something far more powerful. They reached the general store as the church bells began to toll, their bronze voices carrying across the valley like a morning song. Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's wife, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her expression disapproving. She had clearly heard about the wedding's collapse and had formed her own opinions about Sarah's suitability as a tenant. "Miss Mitchell," she said in a voice that carried the authority of property ownership, "I think we need to discuss your living arrangements, given today's circumstances. I'm not sure this establishment is the appropriate place for someone in your position." The implication was clear. Sarah's public humiliation had made her an undesirable tenant, someone whose presence might reflect poorly on the respectable business establishment that had provided her with shelter. It was another blow in a day that had already delivered more than its share of cruelty, another reminder that her place in the community had been fundamentally altered by the morning's events. Thomas stepped forward, his presence suddenly feeling less gentle and more protective. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of being respected for his work and his word. "Miss Mitchell is a paying tenant who has met all her obligations to you. Unless she has violated the terms of her lease, I see no reason why her living situation should change." Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably under his steady gaze. Thomas Bennett was not someone she could easily dismiss or intimidate. His blacksmith shop was essential to the community's daily functioning, and his reputation for fairness and honesty made him a man whose opinion carried weight, even among those who might not welcome his interference in their affairs. "Well," she said, her voice losing some of its authoritative edge, "I suppose she can stay for now. But I'll be watching the situation closely. This is a respectable establishment, and I won't have it turned into some kind of refuge for those who can't maintain proper standards." The words stung, but Sarah was beyond the point where additional cruelty could wound her much deeper. She had reached the strange numbness that comes after overwhelming emotional trauma, the protective mechanism that allows people to continue functioning when their world has been turned upside down. With Dr. Hayes's help, she climbed the narrow stairs to her room, leaving Thomas standing in the store's doorway like a guardian angel hewn from iron and determination. Dr. Hayes examined Sarah with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many different kinds of suffering. Her pulse was rapid but steady, her breathing shallow but regular. The physical symptoms were those of shock and emotional trauma, conditions that would heal with time and care. But he worried about the deeper wounds, the damage to her sense of self-worth that public humiliation could inflict on even the strongest spirit. "You need rest," he said gently, helping her to sit on the room's single chair. "And you need to remember that what happened today says nothing about your worth as a person. Henry Caldwell's cruelty reflects on his character, not yours." Sarah nodded, but her eyes remained distant, focused on some internal landscape of pain and confusion. "I thought he cared for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of activity from the street below. "I thought someone finally saw something worthwhile in me." "Someone did," Dr. Hayes replied, glancing toward the window where Thomas could be seen speaking with a small group of townspeople who had gathered around the store. "Perhaps not the person you expected, but someone who sees you clearly nonetheless." Down in the street, Thomas was indeed making his position known to anyone who cared to listen. Word of his intervention at the church had spread quickly, and various members of the community had come to offer their opinions about his involvement in what many viewed as a private matter. Victoria Ashford had sent her husband to speak with him, clearly hoping that male authority might succeed where her own social pressure had failed. "Now Thomas," said Robert Ashford, a man whose wealth from cattle ranching had bought him considerable influence in the valley, "you need to understand that what happened today, while unfortunate, was probably for the best. Henry Caldwell is a respected businessman with a position to maintain. He can't be expected to make decisions based on charity rather than practical considerations." Thomas continued his work organizing the tools in his shop, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "I understand that some people measure worth by social position and bank accounts," he replied without looking up. "I prefer to measure it by character and kindness. By that standard, Miss Mitchell has more value than most of the people who spoke against her today." "You're being naive," Ashford continued, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "A man in your position can afford to be sentimental about such things. You don't have business relationships to maintain, social obligations to consider. But Henry Caldwell does, and he made the only reasonable choice available to him." Thomas straightened to his full height, his presence suddenly seeming to fill the entire shop. "And what exactly is my position, Mr. Ashford? I provide essential services to this community. I employ 2 apprentices and contribute to the local economy. I pay my taxes and meet my obligations to my neighbors. But because I work with my hands instead of sitting behind a desk, you think my opinions about human decency matter less than yours?" The question hung in the air like smoke from his forge, creating an uncomfortable silence that spoke to the class tensions that ran beneath the surface of Millbrook Valley's seemingly harmonious community. Robert Ashford was accustomed to deference from those he considered his social inferiors, but Thomas Bennett had never shown him anything more than basic courtesy, and clearly had no intention of starting now. "I think," Ashford said carefully, "that you're allowing your emotions to cloud your judgment. Sarah Mitchell is a nice enough girl, but she's simply not suitable for someone of Henry's standing. Surely you can see that." "I can see that Henry Caldwell is a coward who chose to humiliate someone publicly rather than end their engagement privately," Thomas replied, his voice remaining calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I can see that supposedly respectable people stood by and watched cruelty happen without lifting a finger to stop it. And I can see that a woman who has shown nothing but kindness to this community has been treated with less respect than most people would show a stray dog." His words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and Robert Ashford found himself without an immediate response. Other men might have been intimidated by his wealth and social position, but Thomas Bennett seemed entirely unmoved by such considerations. He operated by a different set of values, one that placed human dignity above social hierarchy and kindness above conformity. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Reverend Webb, who had clearly come to add his moral authority to the effort to convince Thomas to withdraw his support from Sarah. The Reverend's thin face was set in lines of disapproval, his dark clothes giving him the appearance of a crow come to pick at the remains of the day's destruction. "Mr. Bennett," he said in the sonorous voice he used for delivering sermons, "I hope you'll consider the wisdom of not involving yourself in matters that don't concern you. What happened today, while regrettable in its public nature, was ultimately a necessary correction. We cannot have people forming inappropriate attachments based on misguided sentiment rather than practical compatibility." Thomas set down his hammer and turned to face the Reverend with the kind of attention he might give to a particularly interesting piece of metalwork. "Reverend Webb," he said quietly, "I've always understood that your faith teaches compassion for those who suffer and protection for those who are vulnerable. Perhaps I've been misunderstanding your sermons all these years." The Reverend's face flushed red at the implied criticism. "Of course we are called to show compassion," he said stiffly, "but we are also called to wisdom, to accepting the natural order that God has established. Miss Mitchell's condition makes her unsuitable for certain positions in society. Accepting this truth is not cruelty, but rather an acknowledgement of divine will." "And what exactly is her condition?" Thomas asked, his voice remaining dangerously quiet. "Being kind to children, having skill with needle and thread, showing loyalty to those who care for her. If these are flaws in your divine order, Reverend, then perhaps your God and mine are not the same." The words carried the weight of a challenge that went far beyond the immediate situation. Thomas was questioning not just the Reverend's interpretation of events, but the entire system of values that had allowed the morning's cruelty to occur. He was suggesting that there might be other ways to measure worth, other standards by which to judge human value. Reverend Webb drew himself up to his full height, his thin frame trying to project authority in the face of Thomas's quiet rebellion. "You would do well to remember your place, Mr. Bennett. This community has standards, traditions that have served us well. We cannot allow them to be undermined by misguided sentiment or romantic notions about equality." "I remember my place perfectly," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found his own sense of worth and refused to let others diminish it. "My place is standing up for people who are being treated with cruelty. My place is using whatever strength I have to protect those who need protection. If that conflicts with your traditions, then perhaps it's time to examine whether those traditions are worth preserving." The gathering crowd had grown larger as word of the confrontation spread through the town. Some faces showed support for Thomas's position, recognizing the fundamental decency of his stand. Others displayed the kind of hostile resistance that people show when their comfortable assumptions are challenged. But all were paying attention, understanding that something significant was happening in their community. Samuel Hart, Thomas's young apprentice, had been watching the exchange with growing anxiety. At 19, he was old enough to understand the social dynamics at play, but young enough to be frightened by the idea of challenging established authority. "Mr. Bennett," he said quietly, approaching his mentor with obvious concern, "maybe we should just let this settle down. People are getting pretty worked up." Thomas looked at the young man with the kind of patience he might show to a son, understanding his fear but also recognizing the teaching moment that the situation presented. "Samuel," he said gently, "there are times when settling down is the right choice, and times when standing up is the only choice that lets you look at yourself in the mirror. This is one of those times when standing up matters more than keeping the peace." The lesson was not lost on the watching crowd. Thomas Bennett was not just defending Sarah Mitchell. He was demonstrating a different way of being in the world, one that prioritized conscience over convenience and moral courage over social comfort. His example was forcing others to examine their own actions and consider what they were willing to stand for when the cost of silence became too high. As the afternoon wore on, the lines in Millbrook Valley were being drawn. On one side stood those who believed that social order required the maintenance of established hierarchies, that people needed to know their place and accept their limitations. On the other side stood those who believed that human dignity transcended social position, that kindness and character mattered more than wealth and status. The battle for Sarah Mitchell's place in the community was just beginning, but already it was clear that her story would become something larger than a simple tale of romantic rejection. It would become a test of what kind of community Millbrook Valley wanted to be, and whether the values of compassion and justice could triumph over the forces of prejudice and cruelty. In her small room above the general store, Sarah Mitchell sat by her window, still wearing her wedding dress, watching the drama unfold in the street below. She had become, without choosing it, the center of a storm that would reshape her community. And standing at the heart of that storm was a gentle giant whose faith in her worth was about to change everything. The evening shadows stretched long across Millbrook Valley as Sarah Mitchell finally removed her wedding dress, the cream-colored silk feeling heavier with each passing hour. The mirror in her small room reflected a woman she barely recognized, her face pale and drawn from the day's ordeal. Outside her window, the sounds of normal life continued as if nothing had changed, but Sarah knew that everything had shifted irrevocably. The woman who had awakened that morning with hope and anticipation was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the harsh truth about how quickly acceptance could transform into rejection. Dr. Hayes had left her with laudanum for sleep and strict instructions to rest, but Sarah found herself unable to close her eyes. Every time she tried, she saw Henry's face as he spoke those devastating words, heard the whispers of the congregation, felt the weight of their collective judgment. The humiliation burned in her chest like a physical wound, made worse by the knowledge that the entire town had witnessed her destruction. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Sarah hesitated, unsure if she could face another well-meaning visitor, or worse, someone who had come to deliver additional cruelty. But the knock came again, gentle and patient, and she found herself opening the door to find Ana Rodriguez, the young seamstress who worked in a shop 2 blocks away. Ana was perhaps 22, with dark hair and kind eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had also faced hardship. She carried a small basket covered with a checkered cloth, and her expression was one of genuine concern rather than the morbid curiosity that Sarah had come to expect from visitors. "Miss Mitchell," Ana said quietly, "I brought you some supper. I thought you might not feel like going out for food today." She paused, her own shyness evident in the way she shifted from foot to foot. "I also wanted to say that what happened today was wrong, really wrong. And not everyone in town feels the way those people at the church did." Sarah stepped aside to let Ana enter, grateful for the first truly kind words she had heard since Thomas Bennett's intervention at the church. The basket contained fresh bread, cheese, and a small jar of honey, simple fare that somehow felt more precious than the finest delicacies. But more than the food, Ana's presence provided something Sarah hadn't realized she desperately needed, proof that not everyone in Millbrook Valley had turned against her. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice still hoarse from crying. "I wasn't sure if anyone would want to be seen with me after today." Ana's expression grew fierce, a fire lighting in her dark eyes that transformed her gentle features. "Anyone who would judge you for what that coward did doesn't deserve your concern," she said firmly. "I've watched you in this town for years, Miss Mitchell. I've seen how you help Mrs. O'Brien with her groceries when her arthritis is bad, how you mend clothes for families who can't afford to pay, how you always have a kind word for everyone. If Henry Caldwell couldn't see your worth, then he's blind, as well as cruel." The words were like balm to Sarah's wounded spirit. Here was someone who had noticed her kindness, who valued her contributions to the community. It reminded her that she had built a life in Millbrook Valley that extended beyond her failed engagement, that she had relationships and connections that Henry's rejection couldn't destroy. I keep thinking about what he said, Sarah admitted, settling into her chair while Anna perched on the edge of the bed. About how I look, about being unsuitable. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was foolish to think someone like him could really care for me. Anna's response was immediate and forceful. Don't you dare let that man's cruelty make you doubt yourself. You are beautiful, Sarah Mitchell. Beautiful in ways that matter, in ways that last. Any man who can't see that isn't worthy of your time or your tears. As they talked, Sarah began to piece together what had happened in the town after her departure from the church. Anna had witnessed the confrontation between Thomas Bennett and the various townspeople who had attempted to convince him to withdraw his support. She described the blacksmith's unwavering defense of Sarah, his refusal to be intimidated by social pressure or economic threats. He stood there like a mountain, Anna said, her voice filled with admiration. Mr. Ashford tried to tell him he was being naive, and Reverend Webb went on about accepting God's will, but Mr. Bennett just kept asking them to explain exactly what was wrong with you. And none of them could give him an answer that didn't sound petty and cruel when they said it out loud. The image of Thomas defending her so steadfastly brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes, but these were different from the tears of humiliation she had shed earlier. These tears carried gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name, a warmth that began to push back against the cold emptiness that had filled her chest since the morning's disaster. I don't understand why he would do that, Sarah said. Softly, we barely know each other. He has no obligation to defend me, especially not when it puts him at odds with half the town. Anna smiled, a knowing expression that suggested she understood more about the situation than Sarah realized. Maybe he sees something in you that you don't see in yourself, she suggested. Maybe he recognizes kindness because he has it himself. And he knows how rare it is in this world. The next morning brought new challenges and unexpected allies. Sarah had finally managed to sleep near dawn, and she awoke to find that news of the previous day's events had spread throughout the valley. Some of the responses were predictably cruel, but others surprised her with their sympathy and support. Old Pete Wilson, the stable-keeper who had worked with horses for over 40 years, made a point of stopping by the general store to speak with her. Pete was known for his blunt honesty and his ability to judge character in both horses and humans. His weathered face was kind as he removed his hat and spoke to her with the respect he might show to a lady of the finest breeding. Miss Mitchell, he said in his gravelly voice, I wanted you to know that what happened yesterday was a disgrace. I've been in this town for most of my life, and I've never seen such a display of meanness towards someone who's never done anything. But help others. You hold your head high, young lady. The measure of a person isn't in what others say about them, but in how they treat those who can't help them in return. His words carried the weight of earned wisdom, and Sarah found herself standing a little straighter as she thanked him. Pete's approval meant something in the community, and his public support would make it harder for others to dismiss her as completely as they might have hoped. But the day also brought reminders of how precarious her position had become. Eleanor Blackwood, who owned the fabric shop where Sarah had purchased materials for her wedding dress, made her feelings clear when Sarah attempted to return some unused lace. I'm sorry, Miss Mitchell, she said in a voice that carried no genuine regret, but I can't take returns on items that have been contaminated by such circumstances. And I'm afraid I won't be able to provide you with materials for future projects. My customers expect me to maintain certain standards. The rejection stung, but Sarah was beginning to understand that such responses revealed more about the people delivering them than about her own worth. She gathered her dignity around her like a cloak and left the shop with her head held high, refusing to give Eleanor Blackwood the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Thomas Bennett had spent the morning at his forge, working through his own complicated emotions by hammering red-hot iron into useful shapes. The rhythmic striking of metal against metal usually brought him peace, but today he found himself distracted by thoughts of Sarah Mitchell's pain and the community's response to it. He had faced his own share of rejection over the years, had been dismissed by potential romantic partners who saw only his size and profession rather than the man beneath. But he had never experienced the kind of public humiliation that Sarah had endured, had never been forced to face an entire community's judgment in such a brutal manner. Samuel Hart, his young apprentice, worked quietly beside him, sensing his mentor's troubled mood. Samuel had been deeply affected by the previous day's events, partly because he had developed his own quiet admiration for Sarah Mitchell's kindness, and partly because he was beginning to understand the complex social dynamics that governed adult relationships. "Mr. Bennett," Samuel said carefully, pausing in his work on a set of horseshoes, "do you think Miss Mitchell will be all right? I mean, after what happened and all?" Thomas set down his hammer and looked at the young man with the kind of attention he gave to serious questions. "I think Sarah Mitchell is stronger than most people realize," he said thoughtfully. "She's faced hardship before and survived it. But she shouldn't have to face this alone, and she shouldn't have to prove her worth to people who are too blind to see it. Are you going to help her?" Samuel asked, his young face earnest with concern. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the question, but all its implications. Helping Sarah would mean continuing to stand against the community's social hierarchy, would mean accepting the consequences of challenging established norms. But the alternative, standing by while a good woman was driven from her home by cruelty, was unthinkable. "I'm going to do what I can," he said finally. "Sometimes that's all any of us can do, but sometimes it's enough." The afternoon brought an unexpected visit from Margaret Turner, a woman whose position in the community gave her words particular weight. Margaret was the widow of a successful merchant, a woman who had maintained her social standing through careful navigation of Millbrook Valley's complex social currents. She was known for her discretion and her ability to see situations from multiple perspectives. Margaret found Thomas in his workshop, her presence immediately commanding attention despite her modest demeanor. She was a woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of understated elegance that comes from confidence rather than display. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "I wanted to speak with you about yesterday's events. I believe you may have misunderstood the situation." Thomas continued his work, but his attention was fully focused on his visitor. Margaret Turner was not someone who spoke without purpose, and her visit suggested that the pressure to abandon Sarah was escalating to new levels. "I understand it perfectly," Thomas replied calmly. "A woman was treated with cruelty, and I chose to help her. There's nothing complicated about that." Margaret studied him carefully, her experienced eyes taking in his steady demeanor and unwavering focus. "You're a good man, Thomas. Everyone knows that. But you're also a practical man, and I hope you'll consider the practical implications of your actions." "Such as?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. "Sarah Mitchell is a lovely girl," Margaret said carefully, "but she's also a woman without family, without significant resources, and now without the protection of an engagement to a respectable man. Her position in this community was always precarious, and yesterday's events have made it untenable." Thomas set down his tools and turned to face her fully. "Are you suggesting that she deserves what happened to her?" "I'm suggesting that fighting against social realities rarely ends well for anyone involved," Margaret replied. "Henry Caldwell may have handled the situation poorly, but the underlying concerns about compatibility and suitability remain valid. You're asking this community to accept something that goes against deeply held beliefs about appropriateness and social order." "I'm asking this community to show basic human decency," Thomas countered. "If that goes against their deeply held beliefs, then perhaps those beliefs need to be examined." Margaret sighed, recognizing the futility of trying to convince him through appeals to social pragmatism. "Thomas, you're a respected member of this community. You have a successful business, you employ people, you contribute to the local economy. But if you continue on this path, you'll find yourself isolated alongside Miss Mitchell. Is that really worth it? The question hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of a genuine dilemma. Thomas understood that Margaret was offering him a final chance to step back from the conflict, to preserve his own position by abandoning Sarah to her fate. The temptation was real. He had worked hard to build his reputation and his business, and losing both would affect not just him, but also his employees and the community that depended on his services. But as he considered the choice, Thomas found himself remembering Sarah's face as she stood at the altar, the trust and hope in her eyes as she prepared to pledge her life to a man who would ultimately reject her in the cruelest possible way. He thought about the kindness she had shown to others, the quiet dignity with which she had faced hardship, and the courage she had demonstrated in building a life for herself after losing her family. "Mrs. Turner," he said quietly, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I can't preserve my standing in the community by allowing a good woman to be destroyed by it. If that means I become isolated, then so be it. Some things are more important than social acceptance." Margaret nodded slowly, her expression suggesting that she had expected this answer even as she hoped to avoid it. "I had to try," she said. "Simply, for your sake and for the sake of the community. This conflict will hurt everyone involved." "The conflict was started by people who chose cruelty over kindness," Thomas replied. "I didn't create it, but I won't pretend it doesn't exist." As Margaret left his workshop, Thomas understood that a line had been crossed. The community's informal leaders had made their position clear, and his refusal to abandon Sarah meant that the battle lines were now firmly drawn. Whatever came next would determine not just Sarah's future in Millbrook Valley, but the kind of community they would all be living in. That evening, Thomas made a decision that would demonstrate his commitment in a way that words alone could not. He closed his shop earlier than usual and walked to the general store, where he found Sarah helping Mrs. Henderson with inventory. The storekeeper's wife watched him approach with obvious disapproval, but she didn't dare prevent him from speaking with her tenant. "Miss Mitchell," Thomas said formally, "I was wondering if you might join me for a walk. The evening is pleasant, and I thought you might enjoy some fresh air." Sarah looked up from her work, surprised by the invitation. A walk with Thomas Bennett would be a public declaration of their friendship, would make it clear to everyone in town that she had his support. She understood the implications as clearly as he did, understood that accepting would bind them together in whatever battles lay ahead. "I would like that very much," she said simply, setting aside her work and reaching for her shawl. They walked through the center of town as the sun began to set, their presence together causing heads to turn and conversations to pause. Thomas's height and Sarah's gentle beauty made them a striking pair, but more than that, they represented something that challenged the community's assumptions about compatibility and worth. As they strolled past the church where Sarah's wedding had been destroyed, Thomas spoke quietly about his own experiences with rejection and judgment. He told her about the loneliness of being seen as nothing more than his size and profession, about the way people assumed that because he worked with his hands, he must be simple or crude. "I've learned that the opinion of people who don't know you doesn't really matter," he said as they paused beside Mill Creek, where the water caught the last rays of sunlight. "What matters is how you treat others and how you live with yourself. By those measures, you're worth more than all the people who spoke against you yesterday." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the evening air. Here was a man who saw her clearly, who valued her for who she was rather than what she represented. For the first time since her humiliation, she began to believe that she might survive this trial, that there might be life and happiness beyond the pain of rejection. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying depths of gratitude that simple words couldn't fully express. "For defending me, for walking with me, for helping me remember that I'm worth defending." Thomas looked down at her, his dark eyes gentle in the fading light. You never needed to be reminded of your worth, Sarah. You just needed to be around people who could see it. As they walked back toward the general store, both of them understood that something fundamental had changed. Between them, what had begun as an act of chivalrous protection was becoming something deeper, something that would give them both the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The town watched them return, and in the safety of their homes, conversations began about what this new development might mean. Some saw it as proof that Thomas Bennett was as foolish as the woman he was defending. Others recognized it as the beginning of a love story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about suitability and worth. But in the shadows of evening, other plans were being made. Victoria Ashford sat in her elegant parlor, surrounded by the other women who formed the core of the town's social hierarchy. They had watched Thomas's public support of Sarah with growing alarm, understanding that his influence could undermine their efforts to maintain what they saw as necessary social order. "Something must be done," Victoria said to her gathered allies. "We cannot allow this infatuation to continue. If Thomas Bennett succeeds in rehabilitating that woman's reputation, it will send a message that our standards mean nothing, that anyone can rise above their natural station through sentiment rather than merit." The women nodded in agreement, their faces set with the determination of people who believed they were fighting for civilization itself. They began to plan strategies that would separate Thomas from Sarah, that would force him to choose between his business and his principles, between his comfortable life and his inconvenient conscience. The battle for Sarah Mitchell's place in Millbrook Valley was about to enter a new phase, one that would test not just her resilience but Thomas's willingness to sacrifice everything for the woman he was beginning to love. The gentle giant who had started by offering simple protection was about to discover that sometimes defending someone means being willing to lose everything else. In her room above the general store, Sarah sat by her window, watching the last light fade from the mountains. For the first time in 2 days, she felt something other than despair. The road ahead would be difficult, but she would not walk it alone. And perhaps, in the end, that would make all the difference. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook Valley when Victoria Ashford's campaign began in earnest. She had spent the night crafting a strategy that would force Thomas Bennett to choose between his livelihood and his misguided loyalty to Sarah Mitchell. Victoria understood that direct confrontation had failed, but she also knew that every man, no matter how principled, had vulnerabilities that could be exploited with sufficient pressure and careful planning. Her first move was to visit Robert Morrison, the banker who held the mortgage on Thomas's property and extended credit to his business. Morrison was a careful man who valued stability and predictability above all else, qualities that made him susceptible to suggestions about the potential risks of continuing to do business with someone who was causing social disruption in the community. "Robert," Victoria said as she settled into the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, "I'm concerned about the direction certain elements in our community are taking. We've worked so hard to establish Millbrook Valley as a respectable place, somewhere that attracts the right kind of settlers and businesses. It would be unfortunate if that reputation were damaged by unseemly associations." Morrison adjusted his spectacles and leaned back in his chair, his pale eyes studying Victoria's carefully composed expression. As the town's banker, he was accustomed to reading between the lines of seemingly casual conversations, understanding when social pressure was being applied and what the potential consequences might be for ignoring it. "I assume you're referring to Mr. Bennett's involvement with Miss Mitchell," he said carefully. "While I understand your concerns about propriety, Thomas has always been reliable in his financial obligations. His business is successful, and he employs several people in the community." Victoria's smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened slightly. "Of course, Thomas is a skilled craftsman. No one questions that. But reliability involves more than just meeting financial obligations. It also means demonstrating sound judgment, maintaining appropriate relationships, and understanding one's role in the community's social fabric. The implication was clear without being stated directly. If Thomas continued to champion Sarah's cause, he might find himself facing difficulties that extended beyond social disapproval. Morrison was being asked to consider whether a man who defied community standards could be trusted to maintain the stability that successful business relationships required. Meanwhile, Eleanor Blackwood was pursuing her own line of attack through the network of merchants who supplied goods to Thomas's blacksmith shop. She visited each of them personally, expressing concerns about the atmosphere that was developing around certain businesses and suggesting that perhaps it was time to reevaluate their professional relationships. "I'm not saying anything needs to change immediately," she told Jacob Whitney, who provided coal for Thomas's forge. "But customers notice these things, Jacob. They notice which businesses they feel comfortable patronizing, which establishments maintain appropriate standards. If people start feeling uncomfortable about the association certain shops have, well, that could affect everyone's business." The pressure campaign was subtle but systematic, designed to create a web of consequences that would gradually strangle Thomas's ability to operate his business effectively. Victoria and her allies understood that most people were reluctant to take dramatic stands on matters of principle, but they could be convinced to make small compromises that would collectively achieve the desired result. Thomas became aware of the campaign when Jacob Whitney arrived at his shop with an unusually small delivery of coal, claiming that supply problems were forcing him to reduce shipments to all his customers. The explanation might have been believable if Thomas hadn't noticed that the coal deliveries to other businesses in town continued at their normal levels. Samuel Hart watched his mentor's face carefully as Thomas examined the reduced shipment. The young man had begun to understand that their support of Sarah Mitchell was creating ripple effects that extended far beyond social disapproval, and he was frightened by the implications of what might happen to their livelihood. "Mr. Bennett," Samuel said hesitantly, "maybe we should think about this situation more carefully. I mean, if people are going to make things difficult for the business, maybe there's a way to work things out without anyone getting hurt." Thomas looked at his apprentice with the kind of patience he might show to a son who was struggling with a difficult lesson. "Samuel," he said quietly, "there are times when doing the right thing costs more than we'd like to pay. But there are also times when the cost of not doing the right thing is higher than we can afford to live with." "But what if we lose everything?" Samuel asked, his voice tight with worry. "What if they make it impossible for us to keep the shop running?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering not just the question but the fear behind it. Samuel was young and had little experience with the kind of moral choices that could define a person's entire life. He was asking practical questions about survival and security, concerns that any reasonable person would share. "If we lose the business because we stood up for someone who was being treated with cruelty," Thomas said finally, "then we'll find another way to make a living. But if we keep the business by turning our backs on someone who needs our help, then we'll have lost something more important than any shop or any amount of money." The lesson was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hayes, who entered the workshop with the brisk efficiency of someone who had urgent business to conduct. The doctor's usually calm demeanor showed signs of strain, and his weathered face was set in lines of concern that suggested he was dealing with something more serious than routine medical matters. "Thomas," he said without preamble, "I need to speak with you about Sarah. There's been a development that you should know about." Dr. Hayes explained that he had been approached by several prominent families in the town, each expressing concerns about his continued treatment of Sarah Mitchell. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. If he wanted to maintain his practice and his standing in the community, he would need to demonstrate appropriate judgment about the people he chose to associate with. "They're not asking me to refuse medical treatment," Dr. Hayes said carefully. That would be too obvious, too clearly unethical. But they're suggesting that perhaps Miss Mitchell would be more comfortable seeking care elsewhere, somewhere that might be more suitable to her circumstances. Thomas felt a cold anger begin to build in his chest, the kind of controlled fury that had served him well in difficult situations throughout his life. The campaign against Sarah was expanding beyond social pressure into areas that threatened her basic welfare and safety. "And what did you tell them?" Thomas asked, his voice deceptively calm. "I told them that I took an oath to do no harm, and that abandoning a patient because of social pressure would violate that oath," Dr. Hayes replied firmly. "But I also told them that I'm an old man who's lived his life and made his choices. You're young, Thomas. You have years ahead of you, and you need to consider whether this battle is worth what it might cost you." The doctor's words carried the weight of genuine affection and concern. He was not trying to dissuade Thomas from supporting Sarah, but he was trying to ensure that Thomas understood the full scope of what he was facing. The forces arrayed against them were more organized and more ruthless than either of them had initially realized. "Dr. Hayes," Thomas said quietly, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I've already made my choice. The question is whether Sarah understands what she's facing and whether she's prepared for what comes next." That afternoon, Thomas found Sarah in her room above the general store, working on a piece of embroidery that she hoped to sell to help pay her rent. The delicate stitches required precise attention, but he could see that her hands were trembling slightly, whether from stress or the effects of the laudanum Dr. Hayes had prescribed for her sleeplessness. "Sarah," he said gently, settling into the room's single chair, "we need to talk about what's happening in the town. The pressure on you is going to get worse before it gets better, and you need to know what you're facing." Sarah set down her needlework and looked at him with eyes that held both fear and determination. She had spent the past few days coming to terms with her new reality, understanding that her life in Millbrook Valley would never return to what it had been before the wedding disaster. "I know they want me to leave," she said quietly. "Mrs. Henderson has made that clear enough, and I can see it in people's faces when I walk down the street. The question is whether I have the strength to stay and fight, or whether I should save us both the trouble and just go." Thomas leaned forward, his expression intense with conviction. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about what kind of community Millbrook Valley is going to be. If they succeed in driving you out through cruelty and pressure, they'll have established that kindness and character don't matter, that anyone can be destroyed if they don't fit the right social mold. But what if they destroy you in the process?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking slightly. "You have a business, employees, a life here. I can't ask you to sacrifice all that for me." "You're not asking," Thomas replied gently. "I'm choosing. And I'm choosing because I've seen what kind of person you are, and I know that letting them win would be letting something precious be destroyed." Sarah studied his face, seeing the absolute sincerity in his expression. Here was a man who was willing to risk everything he had built for a principle, for her. The realization was both humbling and terrifying because it meant that her own choices would affect not just her own future, but his as well. "Then we fight," she said simply. "But we fight smart, and we fight together." The next phase of Victoria Ashford's campaign revealed just how far she was willing to go to achieve her objectives. She arranged for a visiting minister from Denver to conduct a special series of sermons on the theme of moral purity and social responsibility. Reverend Marcus Webb had been instructed to invite the entire community to attend these special services, which would address the spiritual dangers of allowing inappropriate relationships to flourish in a Christian community. The visiting minister, Reverend Jonathan Pierce, was a man who specialized in the kind of fire and brimstone preaching that left congregations feeling both terrified and superior. His sermons were carefully crafted to reinforce existing prejudices while providing religious justification for social cruelty. Brothers and sisters, Reverend Pierce declared from the pulpit of St. Mary's Church, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed sanctuary. We live in times when the very foundations of Christian society are under attack. When people abandon the natural order that God has established, when they allow sentiment to override divine wisdom, they open the door to moral chaos and spiritual corruption. The congregation listened with rapt attention as Pierce wove together biblical quotations and social commentary, creating a theological framework that made persecution seem like piety. He spoke of the importance of maintaining boundaries, of recognizing the natural hierarchies that God had established, of the dangers that arose when people tried to rise above their appointed stations in life. Consider the example before us. In this very community, Pierce continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation, when a woman of questionable virtue is defended by those who should know better, when natural standards of appropriateness are abandoned in favor of misguided sympathy, we see the beginnings of the moral decay that has destroyed other communities, other societies that forgot their duty to maintain godly order. Sarah sat in the back of the church, having decided to attend the service despite the obvious hostility it would generate. She wanted to hear for herself what was being said about her, wanted to understand the full scope of the campaign being waged against her. Thomas sat beside her, his presence both protective and defiant in the face of the congregation's disapproving stares. As Pierce's sermon reached its climax, calling on the community to stand firm against the forces of moral corruption, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The anger and hurt that had consumed her since the wedding disaster began to transform into something harder and more focused. These people were using religion to justify cruelty, were hiding behind piety to mask their own prejudice and fear. When the service ended and the congregation began to file out, Sarah stood and walked to the front of the church. The sanctuary fell silent as she approached the pulpit, her presence commanding attention despite the hostility that surrounded her. "Reverend Pierce," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the church, "I have a question about your sermon. You spoke about God's natural order and the importance of people knowing their place. I'm wondering if you could explain where kindness fits into that order, and whether there's room in your theology for the possibility that God might judge people by their hearts rather than their social position." The question hung in the air, like smoke from an extinguished candle, creating an uncomfortable silence that stretched across the entire congregation. Pierce had not expected to be challenged so directly, had assumed that his authority and the weight of social pressure would prevent any open dissent. "Young woman," he said carefully, "it is not appropriate for you to question the word of God as delivered through his appointed ministers. Your very presence here demonstrates the kind of presumption that leads to moral confusion and spiritual error." Sarah felt Thomas rise behind her, his presence offering silent support as she faced down the man who had used his pulpit to attack her character. "I'm not questioning the word of God," she replied calmly. "I'm questioning your interpretation of it. Because the Jesus I learned about showed kindness to people who were rejected by their communities, who defended those who were being treated with cruelty, who said that the last would be first and the first would be last." The confrontation had gone far beyond what Victoria Ashford had intended. She had wanted the visiting minister to reinforce social pressure against Sarah, not to provide her with a platform for defending herself. The fact that Sarah was able to stand up to religious authority and articulate her position so clearly was dangerous to the entire campaign. "That's enough," Victoria said sharply, rising from her prominent seat near the front of the church. "This is neither the time nor the place for such displays. You have caused enough disruption to this community." Sarah turned to face her primary antagonist, seeing clearly for the first time the woman who had orchestrated so much of the cruelty she had faced. Victoria Ashford represented everything that Sarah had learned to fear about social hierarchies, the arbitrary exercise of power, the willingness to destroy others to maintain one's own position, the belief that privilege conferred moral authority. "Mrs. Ashford," Sarah said quietly, "I have never caused disruption to this community. I have worked quietly, helped those who needed help, and asked for nothing more than basic human decency. If my presence here disrupts you, perhaps you should examine why kindness and acceptance threaten you so deeply." The exchange was witnessed by the entire congregation, and its implications rippled through the community like stones thrown into still water. Sarah Mitchell, who had been publicly humiliated and systematically persecuted, had found her voice and was using it to challenge the very people who had tried to destroy her. Thomas watched with pride and admiration as Sarah faced down her tormentors with dignity and grace. Here was the woman he had seen all along, the strength and character that others had been too blind to recognize. Her courage in that moment was worth more than all the gold in Colorado, and it confirmed everything he had believed about her worth. As they left the church together, walking through a gauntlet of stares and whispers, both Thomas and Sarah understood that the battle had entered a new phase. The community could no longer dismiss Sarah as a victim who would quietly disappear. She had demonstrated that she was prepared to fight for her place in Millbrook Valley, and that she possessed the intelligence and courage to challenge those who sought to drive her away. Victoria Ashford watched them go with cold calculation. In her eyes, Sarah Mitchell's defiance had transformed the situation from a simple matter of social correction into something more complex and dangerous. If Sarah succeeded in establishing herself as someone who could not be easily intimidated or driven away, it would set a precedent that could undermine the entire social order that Victoria had worked so hard to maintain. That evening, as Millbrook Valley settled into uneasy quiet, plans were being made on both sides of the conflict. Victoria and her allies would need to escalate their campaign, to find new ways of applying pressure that would force Thomas and Sarah to surrender. But they had also learned that their opponents were stronger and more determined than they had anticipated. In her room above the general store, Sarah sat by her window, looking out at the mountains that surrounded their valley. For the first time since her wedding disaster, she felt something that resembled hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but she had found her voice and her strength. More importantly, she had found a man who valued her for who she truly was, who was willing to stand beside her against any challenge. The battle for Sarah Mitchell's place in Millbrook Valley was far from over, but the terms of the conflict had fundamentally changed. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued, but a woman prepared to fight for her own dignity and worth. And beside her stood a gentle giant whose faith in her had helped her discover the warrior she had always carried within herself. The autumn winds carried more than fallen leaves through Millbrook Valley as October settled over the community like a heavy blanket. Sarah's confrontation in the church had created ripples that extended far beyond the sanctuary walls, forcing people to choose sides in a conflict that no longer allowed for comfortable neutrality. The town found itself divided into camps that eyed each other with suspicion and hostility, each convinced that the other represented a fundamental threat to their way of life. Victoria Ashford's response to Sarah's public defiance was swift and merciless. If social pressure and economic threats were insufficient to remove the problem, then more direct action would be required. She called together her most trusted allies in the elegant parlor of her mansion, where crystal glasses caught the light from polished silver candelabras, and the weight of inherited wealth provided authority to her words. "The situation has moved beyond what we anticipated," Victoria said to the assembled women, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who was accustomed to having her will obeyed without question. "Sarah Mitchell's display in the church has emboldened others who might question our judgment. If we allow this rebellion to continue, it will spread like wildfire through the community." Eleanor Blackwood leaned forward in her chair, her sharp features animated by the prospect of decisive action. "What do you propose we do?" The economic pressure hasn't been enough to make Bennett abandon her, and clearly she's too stubborn to leave voluntarily. Victoria's smile held no warmth as she outlined her plan. We're going to force them to make a choice between their principles and their survival. I've been in correspondence with certain business associates in Denver who have influence with the territorial authorities. It seems there are questions about Mr. Bennett's compliance with various regulations, concerns about the safety of his workshop, doubts about the quality of his work. The implications were clear to everyone in the room. Victoria was prepared to use her connections and influence to bring official pressure to bear on Thomas's business, to create legal difficulties that would make it impossible for him to continue operating in Millbrook Valley. If he could not support himself, he would be forced to leave, and Sarah would lose her only significant ally in the community. Margaret Turner, who had remained quiet throughout the discussion, finally spoke up with obvious reluctance. "Victoria, I understand your concerns about maintaining order, but what you're proposing goes beyond social correction. You're talking about destroying a man's livelihood based on fabricated charges. I'm talking about protecting this community from influences that threaten its stability and moral foundation." Victoria replied coldly. Thomas Bennett has had every opportunity to demonstrate wisdom and restraint. Instead, he has chosen to champion someone whose very presence undermines the standards we've worked so hard to establish. "But if the charges are false," Margaret began. "The charges don't need to be true," Eleanor interrupted. "They just need to be official. Once the territorial authorities begin investigating Bennett's business, his reputation will be damaged beyond repair. No one will want to associate with someone who's under suspicion from the government." Margaret fell silent, understanding that she was witnessing something that crossed the line from social pressure into outright persecution. But she also understood that opposing Victoria directly would make her the next target of the campaign, and she was not prepared to sacrifice her own position for the sake of principles that seemed increasingly fragile in the face of organized malice. The plan was put into motion with the efficiency of a military operation. Letters were dispatched to Denver containing carefully crafted allegations about safety violations, tax irregularities, and concerns about the quality of work being performed at Bennett's forge. Each complaint was designed to sound plausible, while being difficult to disprove quickly, ensuring that any investigation would be lengthy and damaging regardless of its ultimate conclusions. Thomas became aware of the new threat when Territorial Inspector Wallace Grant arrived in Millbrook Valley with a wagon full of official documents and the authority to conduct a comprehensive examination of the blacksmith shop. Grant was a thin, nervous man who approached his duties with the zealousness of someone who believed that rigid enforcement of regulations was the foundation of civilized society. "Mr. Bennett," Grant said as he spread his papers across the workbench, "I've received several complaints about your operation here. Concerns about safety procedures, questions about your adherence to territorial standards, allegations that you've been conducting business without proper documentation." Thomas examined the documents with growing understanding of what he was facing. The complaints were numerous and detailed, each one requiring specific responses and documentation that would take weeks to compile. Even if he could eventually prove his compliance with all regulations, the investigation would consume time and resources that his business could not afford to lose. "These allegations are false," Thomas said calmly, though Samuel Hart could see the tension in his mentor's shoulders. "My business has always operated in compliance with territorial law, and I have the records to prove it." "Then you'll have no difficulty providing the necessary documentation," Grant replied with the officious satisfaction of someone who enjoyed wielding bureaucratic power. "Of course, until the investigation is complete, I'll need to recommend that certain potentially hazardous operations be suspended pending verification of safety compliance." The suspension effectively shut down Thomas's ability to take on new work or complete existing orders. Without the income from his forge, He would quickly exhaust his savings and be unable to meet his financial obligations to the bank. Victoria. Ashford's strategy was designed to create a spiral of financial pressure that would make it impossible for him to continue supporting Sarah or maintaining his position in the community. Samuel Hart watched the proceedings with growing despair. Understanding that their livelihood was being systematically destroyed by forces they could not fight through conventional means. "Mr. Bennett," he said quietly when the inspector had left, "what are we going to do? If we can't work, we can't pay the bills. If we can't pay the bills, we'll lose everything." Thomas stood in his silent forge, surrounded by the tools and equipment that represented years of hard work and careful saving. The fire that usually roared in the hearth had been banked to cold ashes, and the familiar rhythm of hammer against anvil had been replaced by an oppressive quiet that spoke of dreams being systematically destroyed. "Samuel," he said finally, "there are times when doing the right thing costs more than we can afford to pay. But there are also times when the cost of not doing the right thing is higher than any price we might have to accept." "But what if we lose everything?" Samuel asked, his young voice tight with fear and confusion. "Then we'll start over somewhere else," Thomas replied with quiet determination. "But we won't start over as men who abandoned someone who needed our help when the pressure got too strong." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hayes, whose weathered face showed the strain of recent events. The doctor had been fighting his own battles with the community's leadership, facing increasing pressure to distance himself from Sarah and demonstrate appropriate social judgment. "Thomas," Dr. Hayes said without preamble, "I've been asked to deliver a message from certain prominent members of the community. They're prepared to make this situation go away quietly if you're willing to be reasonable about the future." "What kind of message?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They're offering you a way out," Dr. Hayes explained reluctantly. "If you agree to end your association with Sarah Mitchell and encourage her to leave Millbrook Valley voluntarily, the investigation into your business will be dropped. Your reputation will be restored, your financial difficulties will disappear, and you can continue your life here without further interference." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, carrying with it the weight of genuine temptation. Thomas understood that he was being presented with a final opportunity to preserve everything he had worked to build, to maintain his comfortable life in exchange for abandoning the woman who had come to mean more to him than his own security. "And if I refuse?" Thomas asked, though he already knew that answer as well. "Then the investigation will continue and additional complaints will likely be filed," Dr. Hayes replied sadly. "They're prepared to make it impossible for you to operate any business in this territory. You'll be forced to leave anyway, but you'll leave with nothing." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the immediate choice but its broader implications. If he accepted the offer, Sarah would be left completely alone to face the community's hostility. Without his support, she would have no choice but to leave Millbrook Valley, carrying with her the knowledge that even the man who had claimed to value her worth had ultimately chosen comfort over principle. "Dr. Hayes," Thomas said quietly, "please tell them that I appreciate their generous offer, but I'm afraid I must decline. My association with Miss Mitchell is not something I'm prepared to end, regardless of the consequences." Dr. Hayes nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he had expected this answer, even as he hoped for a different one. "Thomas, I admire your principles, but I fear for what this decision will cost you. These people have resources and connections that extend far beyond Millbrook Valley. They can make life very difficult for anyone who opposes them. Then they'll learn what happens when decent people decide they've had enough of being bullied." Thomas replied with quiet conviction. That evening, Sarah found herself facing her own moment of decision when Mrs. Henderson arrived at her room with an ultimatum that had clearly been carefully rehearsed. The storekeeper's wife stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her expression set in lines of determined disapproval. "Miss Mitchell," she said without preamble, "I'm afraid your tenancy here must come to an end. The current situation has created an atmosphere that's inappropriate for a respectable business establishment." Sarah looked up from her sewing, unsurprised by the eviction notice but still feeling the sting of another rejection. "Mrs. Henderson, I've met all the terms of my lease. I've paid my rent on time, caused no disturbances, and maintained the room in good condition. You have no legal grounds for evicting me." "Legal grounds are one thing," Mrs. Henderson replied stiffly, "but I have a business to protect and a reputation to maintain. Your continued presence here is affecting my relationships with other customers, and I simply cannot allow that to continue." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Henderson opened it to find Ana Rodriguez standing in the hallway, her dark eyes flashing with anger at what she had clearly overheard. "Mrs. Henderson," Ana said with barely controlled fury, "I couldn't help but hear you trying to throw Miss Mitchell out of her home. I'm wondering if you've considered how that's going to look to the decent people in this town, seeing you join in the persecution of someone who's never done anything but help others." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed red at the unexpected challenge. "This is a private matter between Miss Mitchell and myself. It's none of your concern." "It becomes my concern when I see good people being treated with cruelty," Ana replied firmly. "And it becomes the concern of everyone in this community who believes in basic fairness and human decency." The confrontation revealed something that Victoria Ashford had not anticipated in her planning. Sarah's situation was beginning to attract support from unexpected quarters, people who might not have the social standing to challenge the community's leadership directly, but who possessed the moral courage to stand up for what they believed was right. Over the following days, a quiet counter-movement began to emerge in Millbrook Valley. Ana Rodriguez organized a group of working-class women who had benefited from Sarah's kindness and skill with needlework. Old Pete Wilson used his influence among the town's laborers and craftsmen to build support for Thomas's position. Even some of the more prosperous families began to express private doubts about the campaign being waged against Sarah and Thomas. Judge Franklin Stone arrived in Millbrook Valley for his monthly circuit, bringing with him the authority to resolve legal disputes and the wisdom that came from years of observing human nature in all its complexity. Judge Stone was a man who had seen enough of life to understand the difference between justice and mere law, and he quickly became aware of the tensions that were dividing the community. When Victoria Ashford attempted to enlist his support for the campaign against Sarah and Thomas, Judge Stone listened with the patient attention he gave to all presentations, but responded with questions that revealed his deeper understanding of the situation. "Mrs. Ashford," he said in his measured judicial voice, "you've presented me with concerns about social order and community standards. But I'm curious about the specific harm that Miss Mitchell's presence in your community has caused. Has she committed any crimes? Has she violated any laws? Has she caused any actual damage to persons or property?" Victoria found herself struggling to articulate complaints that sounded reasonable when stripped of their social context. "Your Honor, it's not a matter of legal violations. It's a matter of maintaining appropriate standards, of ensuring that people understand their proper place in the social order. And who determines what constitutes an appropriate standard?" Judge Stone asked mildly. "Who decides what someone's proper place should be?" "In my experience, the people most concerned with maintaining social hierarchies are usually those who benefit most from the existing arrangements." The judge's questions exposed the fundamental weakness in Victoria's position. Stripped of its elaborate justifications and social pretensions, her campaign against Sarah was revealed as nothing more than organized cruelty designed to protect privilege and maintain artificial distinctions between people who were essentially equal in their humanity. That evening, Judge Stone made a point of visiting Thomas's workshop, where he found the blacksmith attempting to organize his paperwork in preparation for the territorial investigation. The judge examined the various complaints and allegations with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades distinguishing between legitimate concerns and manufactured grievances. "Mr. Bennett," Judge Stone said after reviewing the documents, "these complaints appear to be largely without merit. The allegations are vague, the supporting evidence is minimal, and the timing suggests they were filed for reasons that have little to do with actual regulatory violations." Thomas looked up from his work with cautious hope. "Can you do anything to stop the investigation?" "I can ensure that it's conducted fairly and expeditiously," Judge Stone replied. "But more importantly, I can make sure that certain people understand the legal consequences of filing false allegations against law-abiding citizens. Harassment disguised as regulatory compliance is still harassment, and it carries penalties under territorial law." The judge's intervention changed the dynamic of the conflict in ways that Victoria Ashford had not anticipated. Her carefully orchestrated campaign was beginning to unravel as neutral parties examined the evidence and found it lacking. More dangerously, her methods were being questioned by people who had the authority to impose real consequences for abuse of the legal system. But Victoria was not prepared to surrender easily. If official channels could not be relied upon to achieve her objectives, then she would need to resort to more direct methods of persuasion. She began to explore options that pushed the boundaries of legal behavior, seeking ways to force Thomas and Sarah to leave Millbrook Valley through means that could not be easily traced back to her influence. The escalation came in the form of a fire that started in the alley behind Thomas's workshop during the dark hours before dawn. The flames were discovered by Samuel Hart, who had arrived early to prepare for the day's work and found smoke billowing from a pile of oily rags that had been strategically placed near the building's wooden walls. Thomas and several neighbors managed to extinguish the fire before it could spread to the main structure, but the message was clear. Someone was prepared to risk destroying property and potentially endangering lives in order to drive them from the community. The fire had been set deliberately, using materials that would burn quickly and intensely, designed to cause maximum damage in minimum time. Sheriff James Cooper investigated the incident with the thoroughness of a man who understood that arson threatened the safety of the entire community. Cooper was a practical lawman who had little patience for social politics, but took seriously any crime that endangered lives and property. "Thomas," Cooper said as he examined the charred remains of the deliberately set fire, "I want you to know that I'm taking this seriously. Whoever set this fire committed a serious crime, and I intend to find them and see them prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But finding evidence that would lead to a conviction proved difficult. The fire had been set by someone who understood how to destroy evidence, and the late hour meant that there were no witnesses to the actual arson." Cooper's investigation revealed that several people had opportunity and motive, but proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt would require evidence that might not exist. The fire marked a turning point in the conflict, transforming it from a social disagreement into something that threatened the physical safety of everyone involved. The community was forced to confront the reality that their dispute had escalated beyond mere social pressure into actual criminal behavior. Dr. Hayes, who had treated several people for smoke inhalation during the firefighting effort, found himself reconsidering his own position in the conflict. The attack on Thomas's property represented a level of malice that went far beyond the social corrections he had initially supported. "This has gone too far," he told Margaret Turner during a private conversation at his office. "Whatever our feelings about propriety and social order, we cannot allow criminal behavior to become the means of enforcing community standards." Margaret nodded gravely, her own discomfort with the escalating situation evident in her troubled expression. "I've been thinking the same thing. When we allow cruelty to masquerade as principle, we risk losing our souls in the pursuit of maintaining our position." The fire had created an opportunity for the community's moderate voices to assert themselves, to step back from the extremes that had been driving the conflict and seek a resolution that preserved both dignity and safety for everyone involved. But it had also revealed the depths of hatred that the dispute had generated, the willingness of some people to risk everything in order to destroy those who challenged their authority. As autumn deepened into winter, Millbrook Valley found itself at a crossroads. The community could continue down the path of escalating conflict, risking the destruction of everything they had built together, or they could find a way to bridge the divisions that threatened to tear them apart. The choice would determine not just the fate of Sarah Mitchell and Thomas Bennett, but the character and future of the entire valley. In her small room above the general store, Sarah sat by her window, watching the first snowflakes of winter drift down from the darkening sky. The fire had frightened her more than she wanted to admit, forcing her to confront the possibility that her presence in Millbrook Valley might ultimately cost Thomas more than either of them could afford to pay. But she had also seen something in the community's response to the fire that gave her hope. Good people were beginning to speak out against the extremes, to recognize that some lines should not be crossed regardless of the underlying disputes. Perhaps there was still a chance for justice to prevail over prejudice, for love to triumph over hatred, for the simple truth that all people deserve dignity and respect to overcome the forces that sought to divide them. The first heavy snow of winter fell on Millbrook Valley like a white shroud, muffling sounds and softening the harsh edges of a community that had spent months tearing itself apart. Christmas was approaching, and with it came a season that traditionally called for peace, forgiveness, and reflection on what truly mattered in life. The fire at Thomas's workshop had served as a stark reminder that their conflict had spiraled beyond reasonable bounds, forcing even the most stubborn participants to reconsider their positions. Judge Franklin Stone used his authority to call a special community meeting in the church hall, citing the need to address the criminal behavior that threatened everyone's safety. His announcement carried the weight of legal mandate, making attendance effectively mandatory for all residents of the valley. Stone understood that healing could only begin when people were forced to confront the consequences of their actions and the harm they had caused to their neighbors. The evening of the meeting, St. Mary's Hall filled with tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Families who had once shared meals and celebrations now sat on opposite sides of the room, their positions hardened by months of bitter conflict. Victoria Ashford entered with her usual retinue of supporters, her elegant clothing and imperious manner unchanged despite the mounting evidence that her campaign was failing. Thomas and Sarah sat together near the back, their presence a quiet statement of unity that spoke louder than any declaration. Judge Stone began the proceedings with the measured tone of someone who had presided over countless disputes and understood the delicate art of bringing resolution to complex human conflicts. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily through the packed hall, "we are gathered tonight because this community stands at a crossroads. Recent events have shown us that we can choose the path of continued division and escalating hatred, or we can choose to remember what it means to be neighbors and fellow human beings." He gestured toward a table where evidence from the arson investigation was displayed, including the partially burned rags and other materials that had been used to start the fire. Someone in this room committed a serious crime, one that could have resulted in death or the destruction of property belonging to multiple families. That crime was motivated not by any legitimate grievance, but by hatred and the desire to drive good people from their home. The judge's words created an uncomfortable silence as people contemplated the reality of what their conflict had produced. Many who had supported the campaign against Sarah and Thomas had never intended for it to escalate to criminal behavior, and they were forced to confront their own complicity in creating the atmosphere that had made such extremes possible. But tonight, Judge Stone continued, we have an opportunity to step back from the brink and choose a different path forward. We can decide what kind of community we want Millbrook Valley to be, and whether we have the courage to live up to our own stated values of compassion, justice, and human dignity. Victoria Ashford rose from her seat with the bearing of someone who remained convinced of her own righteousness, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. "Your Honor," she said in her carefully modulated voice, "while we all regret the unfortunate incident at Mr. Bennett's workshop, we cannot allow that single event to obscure the larger issues at stake. This community has standards and expectations that exist for good reasons, and we cannot abandon them simply because someone chose to express their frustration through inappropriate means." Her words revealed the fundamental disconnect that had driven the entire conflict. Even faced with evidence of the harm her campaign had caused, Victoria remained focused on maintaining social hierarchies, rather than acknowledging the humanity of those she had sought to exclude. Thomas stood slowly, his impressive height and calm demeanor commanding immediate attention from everyone in the hall. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had found strength through adversity and was no longer willing to remain silent in the face of injustice. "Mrs. Ashford," he said respectfully but firmly, "you speak of standards and expectations, but I would like to know what standards you're referring to. Are they the standards that say a woman should be publicly humiliated because she doesn't fit someone else's idea of appropriate appearance? Are they the standards that allow good people to be driven from their homes through lies and economic pressure? Are they the standards that justify criminal behavior in defense of social prejudice?" His questions cut through the elaborate justifications that had been used to defend the indefensible, exposing the ugly reality beneath the polite rhetoric. Thomas was forcing the community to confront the actual consequences of the standards they claimed to uphold, to see how principles had been twisted into weapons of persecution. Sarah rose beside him, her presence drawing a mixture of attention and discomfort from the assembled crowd. Over the months of conflict, she had transformed from a devastated victim into a woman who understood her own worth and was prepared to defend it with dignity and grace. "I would like to say something," Sarah announced, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "When I came to this community, I hoped to build a life here, to contribute what I could, and find acceptance among neighbors who shared common values of kindness and mutual support. I have been disappointed in some of my expectations, but I have also discovered something that gives me hope." She looked around the room, making eye contact with faces both friendly and hostile, speaking directly to the hearts of people who had been caught up in a conflict that had brought out both the worst and best of human nature. "I have learned that true worth is not determined by social position or physical appearance, but by how we treat others, especially those who are vulnerable or different from ourselves. I have seen cruelty masked as principle and hatred disguised as righteousness, but I have also seen courage and compassion from people who risked their own comfort to defend what they knew was right." Her words began to shift the emotional temperature of the room as people were forced to examine their own actions and motivations. Some faces showed shame as they recognized themselves in her description of those who had chosen cruelty over kindness. Others showed admiration for the dignity with which she had endured persecution and the grace with which she spoke of forgiveness. Dr. Hayes rose from his seat near the front of the hall, his weathered face showing the strain of recent events, but also a determination to speak truth regardless of its personal cost. "I have been practicing medicine in this community for over 20 years, he said in his measured voice, "and I have learned that the measure of a person's character is revealed not in times of comfort and ease, but in moments of crisis and difficulty." He looked directly at Victoria Ashford as he continued, his words carrying the weight of professional authority and personal conviction. "I have watched this community's response to the presence of Sarah Mitchell, and I am ashamed of what I have seen. We have allowed fear and prejudice to override our better angels, and we have participated in persecution that violates every principle we claim to hold dear." The doctor's words carried particular, Impact because of his respected position in the community and his initial reluctance to take sides in the conflict. His public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and call for change provided cover for others who had been hesitant to speak out against the prevailing sentiment. Ana Rodriguez stood up from her seat among the working families, her young face bright with the courage of someone who had found her voice through witnessing injustice. "Dr. Hayes is right," she said firmly, her accent adding warmth to words that carried steel beneath their surface. "We have forgotten what it means to be a community, to care for each other regardless of our differences." She gestured toward Sarah with obvious affection and respect. "Miss Mitchell taught my youngest sister to read when she couldn't afford proper schooling. She mended my mother's wedding dress when we couldn't pay for professional alterations. She has shown kindness to people who couldn't offer her anything in return, and she has done it without expecting recognition or reward." Anna's testimony was followed by similar accounts from other community members who had benefited from Sarah's generosity and skill. Old Pete Wilson spoke about her patience with children who hung around the stables, always having time to answer their questions and share her knowledge. Several elderly residents testified to her willingness to help with chores and errands when arthritis or other ailments made daily tasks difficult. The accumulation of evidence about Sarah's character created a powerful counter-narrative to the campaign that had been waged against her. People were forced to confront the contradiction between their treatment of her and her actual behavior, to acknowledge that their persecution had been based on prejudice rather than any legitimate grievance. Margaret Turner finally found the courage to speak the words that had been weighing on her conscience for months. "I owe this community an apology," she said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "I allowed my concern for social order to override my commitment to justice and human decency. I stood by while good people were persecuted, and I remained silent when I should have spoken out against cruelty." Her public confession opened the floodgates for others who had been struggling with their own complicity in the campaign against Sarah and Thomas. One by one, community members rose to acknowledge their mistakes, to express regret for their participation in persecution, and to pledge their support for healing the divisions that had torn their valley apart. Victoria Ashford watched the tide of sentiment turn against her with growing alarm, understanding that her carefully constructed campaign was collapsing under the weight of community conscience. But she was not prepared to surrender easily, and she made one final attempt to rally support for her position. "This display of sentiment is touching," she said with obvious disdain, "but it does not address the fundamental issues that remain unresolved. Standards exist for reasons, and communities that abandon them in favor of emotional appeals inevitably face consequences that extend far beyond individual feelings." Her words might have carried weight earlier in the conflict, but the community had moved beyond the fear and prejudice that had made her arguments compelling. People had seen the actual consequences of the standards she advocated, had witnessed the harm that resulted from placing social hierarchy above human dignity. Judge Stone recognized the moment for what it was and moved to provide formal resolution to the conflict that had divided the community for so long. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with quiet authority, "it seems clear that this community is ready to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and healing. But words alone are not sufficient to repair the damage that has been done." He turned his attention to Victoria Ashford with the stern expression of someone who is prepared to use the full weight of the law to ensure justice. "Mrs. Ashford, while I cannot prove your direct involvement in the arson that threatened Mr. Bennett's property, I can and will investigate any future incidents of harassment or intimidation. This community will not tolerate criminal behavior in defense of social prejudice." The judge's warning carried the unmistakable weight of legal consequence, making it clear that any future persecution would be met with the full force of territorial law. Victoria understood that her campaign had not only failed, but had exposed her to potential criminal liability if she continued her efforts to drive Sarah and Thomas from the valley. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances filled with hope and relief as they realized that the nightmare of persecution was finally coming to an end. The community that had rejected them was finding its way back to the values of compassion and acceptance that should have guided their response from the beginning. As spring returned to Millbrook Valley, bringing with it the promise of renewal and growth, the changes in the community became visible in countless small ways. Sarah's needlework business flourished as people sought to make amends for their previous rejection, and she found herself with more work than she could handle. Thomas's forge roared back to life as orders poured in from customers who wanted to demonstrate their support for his courage and principles. More importantly, their relationship deepened into something that transcended the adversity that had brought them together. Thomas proposed to Sarah on a warm May evening as they walked beside Mill Creek, the same spot where he had first offered her his protection and friendship during the darkest period of her life. Their wedding, held in the same church where Sarah had been humiliated months earlier, became a celebration of love's triumph over hatred and the community's redemption from its own worst impulses. Judge Stone performed the ceremony, his words focusing on the courage required to stand for justice and the importance of communities that support rather than tear down their most vulnerable members. Victoria Ashford did not attend the wedding, having left Millbrook Valley shortly after the community meeting that had marked the end of her influence. Some said she had moved to Denver to live with relatives. Others claimed she had gone east to escape the shame of her public defeat. But most people in the valley preferred not to discuss her at all, focusing instead on rebuilding the bonds of trust and mutual support that her campaign had damaged. Dr. Hayes served as Thomas's best man, his presence symbolizing the redemption that was possible when people found the courage to acknowledge their mistakes and choose a better path forward. Ana Rodriguez stood as Sarah's maid of honor, her friendship representing the alliances that could form when good people recognized their common values, despite surface differences. As the newlyweds walked down the aisle together, the congregation rose as one to celebrate not just their union but the community's return to its founding principles of acceptance and mutual support. The applause that filled the church was not just for the bride and groom, but for everyone who had found the courage to choose love over hatred, inclusion over exclusion, compassion over cruelty. In the years that followed, the story of Sarah and Thomas became part of the valley's folklore, a reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the cost seems too high to bear. Their children grew up hearing the tale of how their parents had faced down an entire community's prejudice and emerged stronger for the experience. The blacksmith shop continued to thrive, becoming a gathering place where people of all backgrounds felt welcome and valued. Sarah's reputation as a seamstress attracted customers from throughout the territory, but she never forgot the importance of helping those who could not afford to pay, continuing to provide services to families in need, regardless of their ability to compensate her. Millbrook Valley itself grew and prospered, attracting settlers who had heard about a community that valued character over social position, kindness over conformity. The railroad eventually came through the valley, bringing with it new opportunities and challenges, but the lessons learned during the conflict over Sarah and Thomas's relationship helped the community navigate future changes with greater wisdom and compassion. The gentle giant who had stood up for a woman everyone else had rejected became a symbol of the strength that comes from moral courage, while the bride who had been called unsuitable became proof that true beauty lies in the heart rather than in meeting others' expectations. Together, they demonstrated that love built on mutual respect and shared values could overcome any obstacle, and that communities were strongest when they protected rather than persecuted their most vulnerable members. Their story lived on as inspiration for others who faced similar challenges, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories are won not through force or cunning, but through the simple courage to say that every person deserves dignity, respect, and the chance to find happiness on their own terms. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.